In this video, we're going to have a look at the different options that you have when it comes to developing Python code. In order to not make this video too long, I've split it up into two parts. In this first part, we're going to take our list of 13 different options and reduce them down to 3. And in the next video, we're going to take a closer look at the last 3 contenders. I personally have been using Jupyter Notebook for the past 10 years. Back then, it was still called Python Notebook. But now Jupyter Notebook is pretty much discontinued. JupyterLab is the successor of it. But the question I usually get asked in my courses is JupyterLab really the best option? What about Spyder, VS Code, PyCharm, Wing IDE, Zed, or online interpreters like Google Colab, Project IDEs, Anaconda Cloud, VS Code.Dev, and GitHub Codespaces? There are a lot of options to choose from, which is why we can be a little bit picky. Main criteria for today are beginner friendliness, so it should be easy to set up, easy to use, and it shouldn't require a whole lot of messing around before stuff works. It should work out of the box. And on top of that, it should be free, because Jupyter Notebook was always free. JupyterLab now is free. And as a beginner, there's no real need to pay for an IDE. We're going to have another video with more advanced features like a debugger, AI features, code refactoring. But for today, I simply want to focus on making it easy to get started and having enough functionality to do plenty of things. Jupyter Notebook, out of all these, has the least amount of features, and in 90% of the cases, it was enough for me in the past 10 years. So PyCharm is already out of today's comparison because you get the Jupyter Notebook features so that you can run individual code cells only in the Pro version. So if you check the link here, Jupyter Notebook support available only in PyCharm Professional, which costs money. So we can already delete that from our table here. Which brings us to the next option, Wing IDE, which has the same problem as PyCharm. The Jupyter Notebook feature is only available in the Pro version. So if you look at their official documentation using Wing with Jupyter Notebooks, it's a Pro-only feature, and their Pro versions cost money. So that is out too. Next option is Zed, which is a relatively new IDE which focuses on speed so that opening files and editing files is faster. They compare themselves to VS Code, and some people say it's the VS Code killer. But first of all, it's not as extensible as VS Code. But the main problem for us today is that right now it only works on macOS. They're working on Windows and Linux support. Excited for Linux or Windows, not yet available. They're working on it, but at least for now, when people come to my courses, I don't want to tell them, you want to write Python code? Buy a MacBook. Yeah, I can't do that. If you have a MacBook, maybe try it out, but as of right now, it's not that feature-rich as some of the other options that we have. So I can't really recommend it yet. But this video will be updated once per year, and next year we'll have another look. Zed is also out. Next, let's have a look at some online interpreters. They have the advantage that nothing needs to be installed locally on your computer. Some of the people that come into my Python courses have the problem that they're using a university computer where they don't have admin rights, they can't install anything, they need to file a ticket with IT support to get anything installed, and we all know how long that takes. So in that case, it might be better to just use an online interpreter, at least to get started until IT has everything sorted out. Only Anaconda Cloud is really a viable option. I'm not a big fan of any of them because I prefer to install my code editors locally and then work there and be able to install environments and everything and have my computer's resources at my disposal. Also, I don't give my code to these companies. So Google Colab and Project IDEs, they're both from Google, whereas VS Code and GitHub Codespaces are both from Microsoft. Both companies use your code to train their AI models, which privacy-wise is a bit problematic, especially if you're working on code from a company. You might have copyrights or patents. Anaconda Cloud is a bit better privacy-wise, but let me show you also in terms of features why Google Colab for me is out. First of all, you don't have Conda as an environment manager, so you can't use Conda install commands. There's pip install available, but since I use Conda install everywhere else, I don't really want to switch. Also, the Jupyter keyboard shortcuts don't work here, and also you can't drag cells, which, for example, in Anaconda Cloud is possible. So let me just show you what I mean by that. What worked here is a table of contents. So if you want to structure your notebook, import statements, variable definitions, I like to use these markdown cells to structure your notebook, and then you have a table of contents where you can click on the headings and jump there, so that works. Also, Vega datasets was installed by default in their standard environment. So this is just a new notebook where I have a couple of cells running. So if you want a completely fresh one, you can create a new one here. This is what a completely empty notebook looks like. And all I did here was test the import statements. So Vega dataset was installed by default, which is good because I use that in my courses. Here, just a simple test, adding 2 numbers and making a basic plot. Matplotlib widget is a tool I like to use to zoom into my plot. By default, it was not installed here. This is where I needed to use the pip install command. That also worked. After that, you need to allow that custom widgets can be used, and after that, the plot finally worked. You have these widget features where you can zoom in into your plot, but it is a bit slow. You can also go back again. But what is not possible is to change the order of these cells. If I wanted to move this cell up, I can do it here with these arrow keys, but I can't just drag and drop it, which is possible in Anaconda Cloud, for example. Also here, if I want to delete this cell now in Anaconda Cloud or Jupyter Notebook, JupyterLab, also VS Code has the same keyboard bindings. You would simply hit escape and then DD to delete it, but that doesn't work. You need to do everything with your mouse here, or maybe there are other keyboard bindings, but I personally don't want to change. And given that most people I know are either using Jupyter or VS Code, where the keyboard bindings are different ones, I don't see a reason to learn completely different ones. But in and of itself, Colab is quite powerful, so a lot of things work out of the box. You also have quite a lot of computing resources at your disposal here. You have 12 gigs of RAM, 100 gigs of storage, and some computer engine backend. I'm not sure how powerful that is, but I'm expecting it to be quite powerful. So Google Colab isn't bad. I just don't see why they didn't make it more compatible with Jupyter. Let's delete that too from our list. Project IDEs is a new project by Google, which is an AI-assisted workspace for full-stack multi-platform applications. So if you look at their page, this is what it looks like. But as I found out later, they do not have Jupyter Notebook features. It's more for app development, backend development, stuff like that, but not really for the type of work that you would use Colab for. So they want to keep it separate. So maybe at some point they're going to integrate Colab into Project IDEs, but they might just keep it the way it is and have Colab for all the data science and scientific applications and Project IDEs for app development and stuff like that. It's not really useful to us, so let's delete that too. Let me just show you why VS Code, Dev, and GitHub Codespaces is also excluded from my list, at least for today. VS Code Dev, the idea was that you have an online version. You can also install VS Code locally on a computer and you can have everything synchronized, which is kind of useful if you use the online version first, then install it later, and then everything is synchronized. But it already shows error messages when just installing Python and doesn't come with a default kernel. So let me show you. After installing, it showed me this. Python has limited functionality in Visual Studio Code for the web, only partial IntelliSense supported, contains extensions which are not supported. It's not very specific, but then you want to do basic stuff here. So with your code cells, a equals 5, b equals 3, print a plus b. This is always my minimum viable example, which an editor should be able to do. However, when you click select kernel, so you need an environment that this runs in, it doesn't give you any default kernels that you can use. So only existing Jupyter server, and then it will ask you for a URL of a running Jupyter server, which basically means you need to set it up somewhere else. I'm pretty sure you can set everything up here, but out of the box, I have installed Python, I have installed Jupyter, so these extensions that you need to get the Python and Jupyter functionality. And in VS Code Desktop, this is enough. It will provide you with some basic environment that you can at least do normal stuff like this with, but here apparently it doesn't work out of the box. With that, VS Code Dev, the online version, is already excluded, which is not too bad because GitHub Codespaces is also from Microsoft, and GitHub Codespaces also offers you a bunch of VS Code functionality. Let's have a look at GitHub Codespaces. I had a couple of problems here installing environments. Let me show you. Codespaces, when you first open it, you have this kind of surface here. So you can start a blank project, a React project, a Jupyter Notebook project, or a .NET project. So GitHub Codespaces obviously is for a lot of different applications, not just, scientific computing, what we're doing, but also app development and stuff like that. And you can create a new codespace here by clicking the Jupyter Notebook template. This is what it already did here. And then you're in this codespace. And you see one problem already. It disconnects quite quickly and then you need to reconnect. So if you think you can just leave this open and then pick up an hour later, it will already be disconnected. Not a big problem, but this is something you don't have to deal with if you install something locally on your computer. It will just always be there. What I try to do here is this, our basic stuff. So here you do actually get a default kernel. It comes with this Python 3.10.13 kernel. So this is some default environment. And then I uploaded my environment file and installed it from there later. But let's have a look at their environment because there is where I had the problems. The basic stuff is working, so you can add two numbers. NumPy and matplotlib is also included in that environment. You can create a basic plot here with some random numbers, create some x values, some y values, and then just plot them. Nothing fancy, but just to try it out. And now something interesting happened. So I wanted to use the Vega datasets because in my course I'm using them. They don't have it, not too bad. Then you install them, right? So you can install Vega datasets, and it worked. Yeah, everything worked here. Then you try importing it again, and it gave the same error message. But if you look at the packages, if you look at the conda list, this is still from the other environment, so let's check it from this environment. If you look at it in the text editor, you can see that Vega datasets was successfully installed, but still it tells you that the module isn't there. I could not figure out a way to get this to work in the environment that was already there. So I uploaded my own environment file. This is the YAML file you see here, and installed a new environment from that file. With that environment, it actually works. So from Vega dataset import data, it works. However, whenever you run this environment, you get this error message that you see here. So GitHub Codespaces, after installing the new environment, this version of Python associated with the selected kernel is no longer supported. Please consider selecting a different kernel. Given that this was an environment that I just installed with the latest Python version, it's odd that it says it's no longer supported. Apparently they have a list of Python versions that they do support, and if you install that, then it'll work. But that means every time you install an environment, you have to be very careful which version to install of what package, and this is not very beginner friendly. Stuff seems to be working, but who knows? When these IDEs tell you that something isn't compatible, everything might look like it's working, but some calculation might be off or something else will break later. For me, that would be a reason not to use it. With that being said, let's delete it from our list, which cleans up our list a little bit so I can finally zoom in. Quick break for a word from our sponsor, me. If you want to know more about using Python for scientific and engineering applications, check out trainingscientist.com, where I offer courses that you can take either as an on-demand course or a blended learning course. If you want to know the difference, check out this video where I explain it in detail and show you what the user area looks like. Back to the video. Let's continue the process of elimination with Spyder. So Spyder is also part of the Anaconda package. So if you download Anaconda, you get Jupyter Notebook, you get JupyterLab, you get Spyder. And if you don't want to download this stuff, you want to work online, you can use Anaconda Cloud. And it's an open source community-driven project, so it's not a big tech giant like Microsoft, like Google, but it's something independent. Spyder serves slightly different functionality than Jupyter and JupyterLab. You can get the notebook feature by installing an extension. It's not really what Spyder was made for. You can also not open Jupyter Notebook files simply by double-clicking. So you open it from the terminal or from Anaconda Navigator. And if you've ever developed in RStudio, this will look quite familiar. So you have a variable explorer here. So if you type in some variables here, let's do our classic example, a equals 5, b equals 3, print a plus b, then you get your variables here. So you kind of have a Jupyter Notebook-like functionality by being able to split up your code into cells and then running them here in this interactive terminal. But JupyterLab simply has more features when it comes to the Jupyter Notebook functionality. For example, table of contents. And also when you have the JupyterLab Desktop app, then you can simply open Jupyter Notebook files by double-clicking on them, which here is not possible as far as I know. Spyder is still a very powerful IDE when it comes to managing larger projects with multiple files. So for example, if you're developing a graphical user interface application in Python, then I would use Spyder. But for basic data analysis, like reading in your data, doing some post-processing on it, like interpolation, creating plots, JupyterLab is simply the better tool to use in that Anaconda universe. We will revisit Spyder in one of the next videos when we compare the IDEs for the more advanced features like debugging, refactoring code, stuff like that. But for a beginner, JupyterLab is the better option in the Anaconda package. Let's also delete Spyder from our list. So let's have a look at the Jupyter variations here. Jupyter Notebook is the old version that is not really being developed anymore. It's just barely being kept alive because it's still part of JupyterLab. JupyterLab has some more of the convenience features that we're going to get into later. But the main problem at this point is because it's not developed anymore, a lot of the features that used to work don't really work anymore. So Matplotlib Notebook, it used to work, but now it's kind of buggy. So on some systems it works, on others it doesn't for no apparent reason. Table of contents works through the Jupyter Notebook extensions, but since they're also not developed anymore, they're buggy now. Ruler and editor, so you know when to do a line break. It's also there, but also buggy. With that, Jupyter Notebook is out. The Anaconda people themselves recommend to use JupyterLab. Let's delete Jupyter Notebook from our list. Two variations of JupyterLab, the classic variation and the desktop version. Let me just show you the difference. So JupyterLab works similarly to Jupyter Notebook. You would have a terminal here and type in JupyterLab and that would open. But in my experience for beginners, this is always a bit difficult, especially if they're not Linux users or macOS users. If they're Windows users, there's a good chance they've never used a shell in their lives. And then explaining how to navigate to their folders where the Python scripts are, then opening JupyterLab, it always led to some confusion. Whereas with the desktop version, you can simply double click on a file in your file system. Let's say here we want to look at the first lecture. You can simply double click it and it will open in the desktop version of JupyterLab. This is quite convenient, and this is something that takes a little bit of explanation away from what beginners need to know to get started. There's also another feature that simply works better, so the Matplotlib Notebook features that you can zoom into plots. In JupyterLab Desktop, it worked out of the box, whereas in JupyterLab, it didn't work out of the box. I tried to install it, something didn't work, then you needed to read something in a Stack Overflow that should fix it, so you install something more, configure something more, and in the end, it was still not working. And this is exactly the stuff I'm trying to get away from, because in Jupyter Notebook, a lot of things were like that something wasn't working, then you need to configure some things to make it work. As a beginner, you don't want to deal with it. And when I'm teaching beginners, I also don't really want to deal with all these nitty-gritty problems, at least not if there are solutions now out there like JupyterLab Desktop. You can install it, things work, and you can get started with programming. Let's delete JupyterLab from our list. If you want to know which one of these last three options wins and have a closer look at how to use them, check out this video.